Hey there, traveler. You look lost. Maybe that's because you stumbled into the game of Break, a place of vibrant mana and strange creatures. Let me tell you a little bit more about it. First things first, the world of Break, called Outer World, is broken. Eons ago, a powerful being called Targrus tried to reshape it, leaving behind a shattered world. And now, we've got sun-drenched gardens, shadowy kingdoms, and everything in between. You'll meet all sorts here. Ingenious goblins, stalwart grooms, and maybe some elves that need a pair of pants, all with their own unique quirks and abilities. And of course, there are others like you, trying to figure out where you fit in. So, what do people do here? Some want to dungeon delve and explore. Others seek power through magic or combat. And yet others live to craft and imbue everyday items to make them immensely powerful. If you take me on as your companion, we'll face dangerous creatures together, uncover ancient secrets, and maybe even shape the future of the outer world. It's a tough life as an adventurer, but what choice do we have? We're playing an OSR game.
Break is an ENnie award-winning tabletop RPG written by Reynaldo Madrigal and illustrated by Carlo Tartaglia, although honestly it looks and feels like a book created by a team of 15 people. It raised a bunch of money on Kickstarter, and I thought it looked pretty neat at the time with its anime setting that never was thing going on, but it ended up being one of the most thoroughly illustrated and conceived OSR games I've ever read. I'll just get the physical product coverage out of the way here so you can see that for yourself. Then in the rest of this video, we'll go through the contents of the game. The Kickstarter for Break was sort of refreshing because all they offered was a regular edition book and a deluxe edition book. No maps, pins, pencils, plushies, or anything like that. And I guess that helped them focus a bit more on the book craft of their product because these are extremely nice. The regular edition has blue page edges and a matte finish for the cover. It's also pretty heavy due to the weight of the paper used for the interior. The end papers are a green-blue gradient that complements the aesthetic of the game. There's a white ribbon bookmark. But yeah, the pages are glossy, full color, and heavy. The colors are sharp and vibrant, and due to the relatively small form factor of the book, the artwork shows absolutely no pixelation or artifacting of any sort. Ultra crisp and clean. Here's something I've never seen before. The book actually acts as a D20 dice roller. So if whatever reason you're playing this game and you find yourself without the D20 required to play it, you can just flip to a random page in this book and get a D20 die result. The book also has easy to reference subheaders along the side of the page, so you can pretty quickly get to the desired section of the chapter that you're in. This is a best practice in layout that you see every so often, but not enough really. And finally, there's a comprehensive index, which is also a best practice, not followed by a lot of indie RPG creators. I used the index several times when making this review, and it was pretty excellent to have. Now, the deluxe edition is identical on the inside, but you get a slipcover that adds a lot of weight to the whole affair. The front has gold foiling on the spine and top and bottom as well, and the back. The book itself is black rather than white and has gold foiling on the spine and the back, as well as gold page edges instead of blue, and a black ribbon bookmark. This so-called Eon edition sports a different cover illustration. This one is more serious and ominous than the regular edition cover. The end paper on the front actually has a little foil debossed title, super fancy. And again, the internals of this book are identical to the regular edition. Heavy gloss paper, full color, all that goodness. The back has a foil embossed symbol. All around, a jolly good show on the book craft for this game. One problem I have with deluxe editions is I'm so afraid to use and damage them, but I should. I should use these books to pieces. So, real quick, if you enjoy this kind of content and want to keep it coming, you can support the channel by pledging $2 or $5 or whatever to the official Dave Thaumavore RPG Reviews Patreon, which is not this fish. The perks are really secondary to the support, but I do have a members-only Discord open to all supporters, and it's really there where I share all kinds of behind-the-scenes stuff and more private opinions about games and the gaming industry. The Patreon Discord is also where I hear your thoughts and suggestions the loudest and the clearest. So if you want to support this kind of content and maybe have a hand in guiding it a little bit, join the Patreon, then join the Discord. So this is pretty much an OSR style game where the players are meant to determine their success by their situational decision making and risk taking rather than highly technical rules applications. And there are other factors as well that make it OSR, but there are some unique differences between this game and your standard cookie cutter D&D retro clone. The first one being your class determines your core ability scores flatly. This instead of rolling them randomly. Actually, in this game, classes are called callings, and there are 8 in the book. A factotum, which is like a jack of all trades, a champion or fighter, a sneak, a raider. Notice those standardized starting ability scores, secondary stats, and starting abilities. You can also play as a battle princess or prince, who has some combat capability but also magic, a sage, which is mostly devoted to magic, a murder princess or prince, and a heretic, which are like the dark side equivalents of the battle princess and sage, respectively. By the way, there are at least a dozen places in the book where you can get spreads like these, where it looks like they've taken screenshots from an anime series and given you a scene, except the anime series doesn't exist. Each of these sequences is just a perfect simulacrum of an animated scene. I think if you've watched enough animated media, you can practically hear the sound effects and the voices when you see these faux screenshots. So I'm not going to go into all 8 of the callings, but let's take a look at what you get with just one of them. In this case, the Sage. There's a short summary of what they're about, what kind of character they would be, and then a description of their 3 starting abilities. In this case, 2 of the abilities are actually items that come with little magical tricks. You get a magical book that occasionally gives you hints when you fail insight checks, and you have a staff that has a simple push spell as well as a light spell, and a small item manipulation cantrip that sort of repairs item for a single use. As you level up, you can choose from 8 standard abilities, and at level 6, from 8 more advanced abilities. These pages that describe each calling are where you're going to find all of your spells. They're not listed in a separate chapter. This is also a good place to note that as lighthearted as the artwork is, this game actually doesn't feel like a modern rules light job that hand waves details everywhere. Just look at this one advanced ability for the Sage, Momentary Fortress. There's actually a lot going on with this spell, and that's the case with the combat, exploration, crafting, and other aspects of this game. This game is really a fully fledged old school role-playing game that feels different from old D&D, but has the same amount of rules complexity. Each calling also comes with a very visual chart of what kind of armor and weapons you're able to use. You'll see this sort of ultra visual representation of information throughout the book, and in some cases, it's done in interesting new ways that I've never seen before. I'll show you when I get to it. And here's an interesting design choice. As you level up, your attack bonus, number of hearts, which are like your hit points, and 5 core stats all increase along a schedule. Each of these tables is different for each calling, but I did find this a really great way to simplify leveling up. One of the biggest defining features of the game's setting is the available species you can choose to play as. Each of these comes with little bonuses or penalties to stats and carry capacity, and some have innate abilities. You have the humans, who are native to the outer world. As the story goes, they were snatched away from a utopia and taken to serve as pets or slaves by various eldritch entities. But I guess they've been freed for a while now. Then there are humans who are dimensional strays. These are essentially people from modern day Earth who have found themselves in the outer world, maybe by way of a magical roller coaster or some other means. Chibs are chibi-style characters blessed with an almost supernatural amount of luck and can obviously get around unnoticed to some degree. Tenebrits get a bad rap for being a dark and sinister species due to their horns, spikes, and fangs, and their legacy as descendants of the so-called shadow monarchs who once ruled over the outer world. But they're cool. Some are evil, but others are good, just like with every species. They can also see in the dark. Raye Neko, which I presume means thunder cats in Japanese, are cat-like people who actually crash-landed on this planet many generations ago. They range from mostly human-looking to mostly cat-looking and have heightened senses and advantage or edge on deafness rolls. Prometheans are a larger than average species, always perfectly muscled, super strong, and fiercely competitive. They can regrow limbs in a matter of days, but the limbs regrow back looking reptilian. They're relatively new to the outer world, but no one knows where they come from. These are both curious features that you can have a lot of fun with in a campaign. Groons are essentially orcs who were originally engineered by an ancient civilization long ago to serve as laborers. They have super strength and a little bit of extra health. Goblins in this setting reproduce very quickly from spores and mostly live underground. They can see in the dark but have disadvantage or snags when doing anything in bright light without their eyes shaded in some way. They have a curious ability to create ugly, noisy, but functional contraptions made from scraps very quickly. As long as the goblin pays attention to the contraption, it will work despite any consideration of physics or general rules of reality. Oh, and every so often, a goblin will release a spore that sprouts into an optional goblin companion within minutes. That companion does not count towards the 2 companion limit that PCs normally have. From a GM perspective, this kind of makes me nervous. 2 companions per PC is already pretty generous. The real problem there comes from turn economy and spotlight management. And when you add a 3rd companion for Goblin PCs, that makes the potential problems even worse. Anyway, the dwarves in this setting are as old as the outer world itself, according to the lore, and tend to live in dark ruins and caverns. They're born from stone and can even manipulate stone and clay with their minds, but can only pull that trick once per day. They can see in the dark, but also have that same penalty with bright sunlight that goblins have. Elves in the setting are actually primordial demigods, each trapped in a physical body. They're often quite aloof, and they don't even raise their own children, so they've lost most of their original wisdom and knowledge. In normal elven fashion, they never age, and you can choose one ailment from the game that they are immune to. Biomechanoids are the final species in the book. No 2 look the same, and they are essentially robots. The outer world is filled with these, but most of them are dormant and abandoned, creations from another time. As robots, they don't need to eat, breathe, or sleep, but they do have to recharge, and their injuries table is different from the organic species. They can also communicate with any machine in the outer world. There are essentially 4 major homelands that your PC can come from, and I'm honestly not sure how I feel about the level of detail that the book goes into for each of these regions. So you have the Wistful Dark, a land cloaked in shadow, the Twilight Meridian, a maritime land rich with trade and culture, the Blazing Garden, a hot, lush land filled with huge, glittering cities, and the Buried Kingdom, an underground war zone. But here's the thing, let's take the Wistful Dark for example. You can roll or choose from amongst 12 personal histories from this homeland, and they're always divided into outcast, commoner, or elite. Just from reading the personal histories here, you can glean a little bit about the Wistful Dark. Oh, and by the way, I have to point out that there are 2 very creatively conceived written languages for each homeland. I thought that was such a good touch. But with regard to the histories here, they aren't super distinctive. I don't get a strong sense of how the Wistful Dark is governed or organized. Now, way later in the book, there is a section devoted to describing the outer world directly, but check this out. These 2 pages are all you get for the Wistful Dark. Some sights and sounds, some regional dynamics, and a few sparse location descriptions with extremely brief plot hooks. Now again, this book runs 473 pages, and they really couldn't have crammed much more into it, so maybe they just ran out of room and prioritized other aspects of the game. My hope is that one day they'll release a full world book for Break. They certainly have the seeds for a truly incredible setting book. One thing I forgot to mention is that each of these personal histories that you choose based on your homeland come with so-called purviews. In the game, anytime you make a check or contest that falls under one of your purviews, you can potentially apply a +2 minor bonus to that roll. So this sort of encourages you to lean into your character's tendencies a little bit. Every character suffers a random +1 and -1 to a core attribute. This is the game's way of mixing up your starting attributes because otherwise they'd be the same every time. Every character also starts with one quirk. These are divided into quirks for biomechanoids, for dwarves, elves, and goblins, and for all the other species. Each of these groups has 10 possible quirks to land on. The way that some of these are designed, they're not supposed to come up any more than once or twice in a session, but they each have an aspect that helps you in a rare situation and an aspect that penalizes you, either mechanically or narratively. That being said, there are some groups of quirks that will be constantly in play, such as these physiology quirks. +1 to a core stat, for example, is a massive perpetual boost to a character. I think as a GM, I'd allow players to just choose their quirk rather than roll for it, because some of these are just way more satisfying and useful than others. I'm going to mostly gloss over the gear details here, but I do have to point out that every weapon in this game, as well as virtually every other listed item or aspect, has its own illustration. This is almost completely unheard of in RPGs because it is so impractical. Even though it would be ideal to have a picture for every item and thing in a game, the artistic and budgetary demands to make that happen are completely unrealistic in most cases. You probably don't have to draw everything out if you're just making a simple retro clone of D&D or whatever basic fantasy setting, but if you're trying to create a new world that no one has ever seen before, then the more pictures the better. And not just landscapes and skylines, but stuff like this. Illustrations of the things that actually intersect with player characters directly. And this goes back to my comment about this game conjuring an anime series that never was. There is so much visual support for the outer world in this book that it practically creates the world. Oh, and on that point about this game being surprisingly detailed with its rules, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. There are little rules for rations versus hearty rations, which are different from treats or booster cakes. It's pretty involved. There's also attention spent to companions, as mentioned earlier, as well as pets and mounts. Again, such stunning and imaginative illustrations here. As far as leveling up, you are awarded XP at the end of every session with a default of 1 XP per hour played. I've never actually seen that before. You also get 1 to 3 discretionary XP from the GM for each achievement in the session. The level cap in the game is 10, and this all seems pretty standard. Let's flip back and take a look at the advancement table for any given calling. This one is for the champion. As you can see, XP requirements to advance are pretty predictably parabolic. You could conceivably gain a level every session until level 4, and then it would take about 2 sessions per level, and then maybe 3 or 4 sessions per level towards the end. There is this whole other layer to your character called allegiance, and it's basically balanced along 2 forces, dark and bright. As you gain magical abilities, interact with characters and items, or take on certain effects through the course of play, you will gain dark and bright allegiance points. Once you've reached a certain threshold going either way, you'll be able to roll or choose from 10 gifts from either side of the spectrum. These are not mechanical in nature, but rather alterations to your appearance, which hopefully the GM will take into account in social situations. There's actually not much to say about the core mechanics of this game. It's a roll under d20 system, where you roll a d20 and attach modifiers to that roll. Advantage, where you roll twice and take the higher roll, is called an edge. Disadvantage in the game is called a snag. Many modifiers in the game are simplified into minor and major bonuses and penalties, which come as plus or minus 2 or 4 to the roll. Rolling a natural 20 is an automatic failure of whatever you're trying to do, and oddly, rolling a natural 1 means absolutely nothing. Instead, you will achieve a special success if you roll the exact value of the difficulty number you're trying to meet or go under. So that mixes it up a little, I guess. Journeying in this game is a bit more formalized than I was expecting. If you're doing travel from one point of interest to the next on a world or area map, then think of it as a sort of special phase of play. There are actual steps you would take here. The first part of it boils down to rolling to see if you get lost or not during that day of travel. How badly you get lost comes down to a second roll. There are also potential encounters that you face during a day's travel, and in the end, your party has to decide to either camp to avoid fatigue and do camp activities that will help the party, hunt and forage for food, or rush, which is an option to forge ahead on the path an extra day, but take on fatigue. There's actually a second very formalized phase of play in the game called exploring. Instead of just saying that your characters walk here or there and interact with whatever they observe, your party actually assigns exploration roles and chooses a movement type whenever entering a new location. Depending on the role and the movement type you've all chosen, incoming threats will be handled differently by the rules. For example, if your character is the vanguard of the group, then you can forfeit any checks for yourself in order to protect everyone behind you from a sudden blast or trap that gets set off. You also get an extra turn to not be attacked if the characters behind you suddenly get ambushed. There are all kinds of rules for your elected movement type as well, and you can only choose to do 3 types of things at any given stopping point. It's also formalized as to be somewhat abstract. It's just the nature of the game. It takes on a sort of rigidity here that sort of narrows the strategic options for the players. There are only a few things worth noting about combat. The first is that turn order is by group. So if your group gets the jump on the enemy, then everyone in your group gets to sort out their order each round before the enemies go. The second thing is that combat movement is divided into areas that can each have conditions which affect movement. This is also referred to as zone-based combat, as opposed to grid or hex-based combat, which requires specific length measurements. The third thing is that you get 1 action and 1 movement per turn. Actions can be anything like an attack or an assist, but there's one particular action that caught my eye, and that's Combat Trick. With these, the player comes up with a creative attack or tactical move, and then the GM comes up with a roll for it, or deems it an automatic success. But here's the thing. If the player tries to do the same trick again, they suffer a snag, which means they have to roll twice and take the worst of the 2 rolls. Or if it automatically succeeded the first time, they simply can't do it again. This definitely helps to keep the players on their toes and to come up with new ideas in combat. I have to point out one of the most elegant injury tables I think I've ever seen. When you reach 0 hearts in this game, you have to roll on this injuries table with a single d20. Your first injury is a light one and is represented by the green die. The second injury that you take, if you haven't yet healed, is represented by this orange die. Notice how the second injury overlaps with the light injuries, but includes these much worse possibilities. And on your third injury and thereafter, if you haven't been treated, your d20 roll could also possibly land on a quiet or messy death. This is just a really incredible way to lay out the information. Not to mention the injury location charts that can also be quickly resolved with the d20 roll. There are 15 named ailments in the game, and they're mostly as you'd expect. Fatigued, dispirited, blinded, etc. But there are a few that I thought really captured the lighthearted and cartoonish nature of the setting. Ballooned is when your character has ballooned up to the point that you can't fit in your clothes or fit through doorways. Chibbed is when your character is suddenly rendered into a chibi-style caricature of themselves. Actual chibs and other small species in the game are actually immune to this ailment. And jellified and putrefied sort of speak for themselves, but I love that they've been included. The prospect that your character could ever even recover from these particular ailments means that the setting is really pretty chill. There are a lot of pages devoted to crafting, but I'm not going to get too into it. The idea is that your character first needs to have the requisite crafting skills, tools, materials, and workshop space required, but if they do, they can make custom weapons, shields, armor, and items. But they can also imbue existing items with magic materials to basically make enchanted items. I can't really glean how this would play out at the table. My guess is that getting the right materials, skills, workshop, and everything all lined up would be the hard part, possibly taking multiple sessions, and then the actual crafting would come down to one downtime and a roll of the dice. But I do appreciate that the rules are there for tables to explore. Actually, crafting does come with a table of mishaps, so there is risk involved. I think the most interesting results on this table are these three: alive, jealous, and intelligent, where the item becomes sentient and talks to you. My spotlight worry crops up again a little bit here. Imagine a player who has a goblin PC with 2 standard companion NPCs, their bonus goblin companion, and a talking weapon. That's a lot of turn time for that player if they're the talkative type. All right, let me share with you my personal pros and cons for Break. Cons: rules minutia. I was a little taken aback by the level of detail that the game drilled down to. As I started reading the rulebook a second time, honestly, it didn't seem as daunting, but I warn anyone who sees the artwork for this game and subconsciously assumes that it's a rules light, story first kind of RPG. It's actually fairly procedure heavy with some strong OD&D roots as far as having a rule to deal with all kinds of little fringe cases for everything. Exploration rules. I'm not sure how I feel about having exploration of rooms and areas so formalized, with everyone in the party taking up one of 4 positions as if they were always walking in a line, and having one of 3 movement types, each with mechanical bonuses and penalties attached to them. On one hand, it really simplifies things and streamlines the process of dungeon delving and otherwise poking around in a dangerous area. But on the other, it really seems like it would restrict players a little bit from doing the thing that OSR people love to do, which is come up with completely original solutions for problems their characters face. The exploration procedures and rules are not a heavy restriction on creativity, but the abstraction is a bit of a dampener. Needs more lore. I can practically feel the pain of the creators having to leave some things out of this book. They probably had to cut a lot of things to fit this very complete game into 473 pages. But in the end, I was left wanting a lot more lore about the world. Alright, pros. Extraordinary artwork. You may or may not be into anime and that style of illustration, but it's hard to deny that the lines and the colors, the compositions, characters, and creatures that Carlo Tartaglia created for this book are some of the best in this particular style ever made for an RPG. There is so much to say about these illustrations. One, they are aesthetically consistent across hundreds of pages. There's not a mix of styles. You just get one unified look. 2, it's familiar but different. That's par for the course with anime, or fictive anime in this case. You want some familiarity, but there needs to be veins of originality or it can be sort of contemptible. And 3, there's so much artwork, along with those faux screenshots, that it manages to create a world without even much lore written. I definitely feel a strange sense of longing to watch this anime series that exists only inside of Carlo's head. He has created so much visual reference to this fantastical setting that along with Reynaldo's writing, you could practically hand this book to an executive at an anime studio and say, here, this is the Bible for a new show. Extraordinary layout. The internal layout for this game is very generous in terms of the amount of space it takes up when displaying information, and that's one of the reasons why you end up with such a high page count, but that choice leads to way more readability and ease of reference. Everything is either in a short paragraph or a bullet point or list, and all of it is loaded with cross-references to other pages. There are also a number of unique hybrid tables that combine information with relevant, helpful illustrations. Some of these table layouts are super clever in how they use space. The virtual dice roller is a fun gimmick that I've never seen before. I'm not sure how many people would ever find themselves playing this game without a D20 on hand, but you never know. The chapter references on the side of each right-hand page are super useful for finding things quickly, and these are also all hyperlinked in the PDF along with those hundreds of page references that I mentioned, so that navigating the PDF almost feels like poking around a live website. This is really peak PDF design here. And finally, the index, which is also hyperlinked, of course, is extremely thorough, which is the way an index should be. Fully conceived rules. I think in one way, it's to the game's credit that it has so much granularity to its rules. This is not Pathfinder by any means, but it doesn't shy away from having little rules for all kinds of things. It's a meaty, fully conceived set of rules that clearly took years to write and polish. Straightforward leveling matrices. I love how when you level up in the game, you just have a static set of increases to your stats. You still get to choose your new abilities, but there's a regularity to the character progression. This speeds things up by keeping it simple and straightforward. Can play as yourself. There's a good amount of space in the game carved out for players to choose to play as a person from our world. This is not a new concept. In fact, it's a whole established genre of anime and manga called isekai, or different or other world. It's defined as stories in which a person from our modern world is transported, reincarnated, or summoned into a fantasy world or realm. I love just having that option in this game, and I'd love to see it in more games. It just gives players and tables that option of bringing that fun and often funny fish out of water perspective to an adventure. Great GM and enemy guides. I completely glossed over the comprehensive GM and bestiary chapters of this book because this video is running a little long, but these two sections of the book are thoroughly written and very well organized. The GM section gives you tons of tips on how to run the game, but also a lot of resources for generating quests, NPCs, and adventure sites. And the enemies chapter has a couple dozen creatures to encounter, not all of them monsters to be killed necessarily. There are some truly creative and interesting adversaries, not to mention guidance on how to reskin and retheme any of these creatures, and how to create completely new creatures from scratch. It wasn't until I got through these chapters that I realized that this book is truly a complete RPG. Well, minus the deep lore details, but you can only do so much in a single book. This could have easily been split into 2 books already, but they managed to fit all this into one amazing brick. And by brick, I mean this ultra high quality, heavy, stitch-bound tome that is Break. The colors are perfect, the paper is great, it's sturdy, it's got a bookmark, and the deluxe edition has a heavy-duty slipcase. Both editions are beautiful artifacts. You know, maybe the absence of exhaustive lore in Break isn't a limitation so much as it's an invitation. While many RPGs load GMs with pre-built worlds, Break hands you a vibrant but incomplete canvas and a set of tools to finish it. These gaps in the lore shift the responsibility and the joy of world building squarely onto the table. Players and GMs have to become the world's architects, filling the outer world's cracks with their own creativity and choices. That makes Break a bit more of a collaborative experience, offering a play experience where the world emerges session by session from the adventures at the table. The hints and seeds that the book provides, faux anime screenshots, quirky species, brief region descriptions and plot hooks, and sparse overall timeline are maybe just there to spark the imagination, not dictate it. So in a way, the game's lack of comprehensive lore is its most exciting feature because it means no 2 tables will ever play in the same outer world. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the game as well as your experiences if you've played it. Links are below if you want to pick this game up, and of course I'd love to see you on my Patreon and newsletter. Thanks for watching. See ya.